All right. And here we go. All right. Oh, you're good. All right. All good. Okay. So you can go ahead and start it if you don't mind.
Yeah, I'm just gonna set it up.
You're good. All right. So we already talked about the failure of Roanoke Island, and part of that failure had to do with the fact that England just sort of abandoned the whole venture because they're at war with who? Spain. Very good. They're at war with Spain. Really, we're not going to see a return to colonization until after the death of Elizabeth and the end of that war with Spain. Remember, the war ends in 1604. After Elizabeth dies, ironically, her cousin's son, James I, Mary Queen of Scots, who Elizabeth had executed, he ascends to the throne as the first of the House of Stuart. Okay? They're a group of very wealthy noblemen, lawyers, navigators, merchants that decide to establish a joint stock trade company in London known as the Virginia Company of London. And they're going to be led by this guy named Bartholomew Gosnold. Gosnold was had been a lawyer by trade, had been a navigator, was a privateer, had done quite a bit of exploring, and he's kind of leads the venture. They get a land grant from James I. The land grant's pretty substantial. The land grant pretty much goes from Virginia, North Carolina area, all the way up to like present day New York. So it's a pretty large chunk of land. They know where they want to go, right? They want to go to the Chesapeake Bay. That was where the last set of Roanoke settlers were supposed to go, but they didn't. They wound right back up in Roanoke Island. This group, they're setting out for the Chesapeake. Just under 200 people go under the leadership of Gosnold, as well as ship captain, a guy we've all heard of before, Christopher Newport, right? We've all heard that guy's name. They're aboard 3 ships, the Godspeed, the Discovery, and the Susan Constant, okay? They are going to make a landfall at, are you familiar with like Cape Charles?
Yeah.
Okay, they make a landfall there, and then they're going to go up the river that they named in honor of King James, the James River, right? Not far away from us at all. And they choose this little plot of land along the James River, and they disembark on May 14th, 1670. They're down to about 144. They lost about 40 on the way over. All right. Almost out of the gate, they have significant problems. All right. They've chosen a tract of land that was really perfect for defense. They knew they could establish a defensive fort there that would protect them against attack on land or attack by water, but they have chosen a swampy site. And the water will be what? Good. It will be salty. We call this water brackish. And this creates a huge problem for them early in the venture, because this is not a problem that we face. I mean, we might take in some salt water and swallow it when we, like at the beach, and it's gross, and we spit it out, and we wash our mouths out with regular water. But at this period of time, they're drinking this brackish water, and the more they drink, the worse off they get, because their organs are absorbing all the salt is basically sucking the water out of their organs, but their brain's telling them, you're thirsty, you're thirsty, you're thirsty. So what they wind up having here is they like pretty much go insane, but what they really have is kidney and liver failure. So that was a huge problem. You also have problem with disease. Dysentery was a big problem, which is very gross. We just, we don't need to get into that. We understand what dysentery is, right? It's sick. Typhoid, yellow fever, malaria. If they could find a way to die, they found it in Jamestown. I mean, it was ridiculous. Gosnold died really early on. He died in 1607, which is actually going to be pretty pivotal because he's the guy that convinced John Smith to go. And Smith was actually locked up for mutiny on the way over. But then when they got there, they discovered that the Virginia Company had elected him as a leader. And so that led to his acquittal. And once Gosnold passes away, this is where we're going to start to see Smith's influence sort of increase as he rises up the ranks in leadership. One big problem that they faced, they thought that they were going to find like the next Tenochtitlan, but they don't, right? And they spend way too much time focusing on building the fort and digging for gold, rather than digging for digging wells or building lasting living structures. And think about the amount of calories they're burning building this fort and digging for gold, and they find no gold. All right. Another big issue is there's no women. All right. Especially in the first group. There will be a small group of women that will arrive in 1608, but we don't really see our largest group of women arrive until later, like around 1619. Have you all ever heard of the bride ships before? This is like really weird and creepy, but basically these women applied to go to Jamestown and they were brought over and they were traded for tobacco. And yeah, that was basically the courting is very romantic, right? It's pretty horrible. So that's how the bride ship situation went. And I'm going to talk more about the bride ships as we move forward. Not today, but when we talk about colonial life. So no women being there is a problem. You also have lots of gentlemen, okay? And these are people that refuse to do work. They thought that they were going to be they were nobility, right? And they're just going to come to Jamestown and they're going to bring servants with them and they're going to do nothing. And the really messed up thing is a lot of the servants that were brought over were children, like young boys that were plucked off the streets of London that were orphaned and brought over as servants. And really that creates a problem. That was Smith's biggest issue. He's like, we need more farmers. We need more carpenters. We don't need more gentlemen and alchemists and people looking for gold. We need people that can actually carve out a life here, not people that are going to come over here and do absolutely nothing. Another huge problem, now they did have a supply ship arrive in 1608, but in 1609, they had a really huge disaster happen. And that was, they had 3 supply ships coming. One was lost at sea. One ran aground in Bermuda, and only one actually made it there. And they just didn't have enough supply to get them through the winter of 1609, 1610, which is better known to us as the what time? Does anybody know what it's called? Has anyone ever heard of the starving time before? Yeah, that's going to be that era. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And then, of course, you guys did a good job with this before, bringing this up. The colonists violently clashed with the Powhatan. The Anglo-Powhatan wars were like a roller coaster. And we're going to talk about that as we move forward today. Does anybody have any questions up to this point? Yeah.
What did you say the names of the 3 ships were?
The Godspeed, the Discovery, and the Susan Constant, which you can actually visit. You get out there, you can visit the replicas of those ships. It's kind of cool, and it's they are small. I mean, everyone was crammed into these 3 ships. the Susan Constant, Godspeed, and the Discovery. So this on the top left is the symbol of the Virginia Company in London. You can obviously see there's King James on the medallion. Bottom left, we have, that's what the fort would have looked like on this little spit of land, of swamp area and along the James River. Top center, we have the building of the fort. Bottom right, this would have been like more of like a prosperous time in Jamestown. But honestly, like this top right primary dock, I think is one of the coolest and most compelling. For many of you out there, this might be the first time you're ever seeing this. This is the oldest known sketch of the fort at Jamestown. And where they found this sketch was in a very unlikely place. It was found in the margin of a Spanish spy's journal. So there were Spanish spies watching all this unfold, and this has now become the symbol of the Jamestown Preservation Society. So if you're ever like down there and you see their hats or their shirts, that's that sketch of the fort is their logo. I think that's kind of cool. I don't know about you guys do, but pretty interesting. So in 1608, Smith takes control of Jamestown. He's not just a governor, though. He's an explorer. In fact, many of you all have probably walked in his path. Anybody ever gone down a pony pasture before? Probably everybody, right? He explored all that, okay? He's looking for a Northwest Passage that he's not going to find. Now, somewhere during his expedition along the Rappahannock, where my Rappahannock kids at? Anybody grew up going down the Rappahannock? Cool. Okay. Not far from off the Rappahannock, that is when he is captured and brought into Powhatan's Longhouse ceremony. All right. Now, the perception, or at least the perspective of what happened in the Longhouse ceremony is different from both points of view. Like Smith, in his autobiography, basically says they were going to kill me, and the daughter of Powhatan, Pocahontas, saved my life. I would have been a dead man. But the Powhatan perspective is that they're actually performing a ceremony in which they were bringing him into the tribe as an ally. You know, you got two different points of view here. Obviously, this works out, though, for both groups, because Smith is going to end up becoming the Powhatan's closest ally, and at least until he heads back to England, he keeps the colony afloat because now they have a trade relationship with Powhatan. Tragically, Disney has really messed us up, all right? The Pocahontas film should have never been done the way that it was. There is no love interest between John Smith and Pocahontas. She's like 10 or 11 years old, and he's in his 30s, okay? Was there a relationship and an alliance? No doubt. But she's not going to marry until 1614, and that's going to be not to John Smith. She's going to marry John Rolfe, okay? So, Disney. So annoying. Anyway, this relationship goes pretty well, but then when Smith is with them for like months, all right? And when he goes back, he's got all these gifts and offerings and food supplies, and Jamestown is in like total shambles. The death rate is staggering. People are, the gentlemen are working. The child servants are being horribly abused. And he's like, okay, enough of this. This is where he is going to institute the no work, no food policy. If you don't work, you don't eat. And then we start to see like livable dwellings that are built. Wells are going to be dug. Things are starting to turn around a little bit, and then boom, there's a gunpowder explosion, and he's injured and sent back to England. He will never return. That is when a couple of problematic leaders come into play here. We have a guy by the name of Captain Percy, bless you, and another guy by the name of Governor Radcliffe. I think you've probably seen Pocahontas 2, the Disney film Radcliffe. You would remember that guy. Well, everything just falls apart. So once Smith goes, war is just gonna take off from the time he leaves all the way until 1614. And it won't be until the marriage of Pocahontas and Rolfe that peace is reinstated, but only for about a 4-year period. All right. Radcliffe, he meets a pretty brutal end. He thinks he's going to be able to meet with Powhatan like Smith did, and that there's going to be this this negotiation, and they're going to be able to work it out. And instead, what they did to Radcliffe is they basically fillet his skin with oyster shells, skin him alive, and burn him at the stake. So it didn't work out for Radcliffe. Pretty hardcore. When we move into 1609 and 1610, this is when things get even worse because they have no supply. And they've run out of what little supply they got in 1609. And this is the period called the starving time. They're reduced to eating rats, snakes, mice, dogs, and eventually dead flesh. So they resort to cannibalism. One of the few women that actually arrived and married was suffocated by her husband, and most of her body was devoured with the exception of her head. So the cannibalism thing was brutal in Jamestown. Come 1610, a relief party arrives, and this is going to be a turning point. When the relief party arrives, those people are like skeletons that have survived. And they're like, get us out of here. We're done. And the new colonial governor, Lord Delaware, also known as Thomas West, is like, nope, nobody's going anywhere. We're staking a claim, and we are going to wage total war on the Powhatan. So his tactics were absolutely ruthless. Like what the English did against the Irish with the Irish Catholic uprising. It's like scorched earth warfare. Burning villages, killing natives, regardless, like men, women, and children, kidnapping natives. Did you all know that Pocahontas was kidnapped and held for ransom? Okay, that's how her and Rolfe met. And then they'll eventually marry in 1614, and that will cement a small period of peace. Another really important person on that ship, that relief party ship in 1610, John Rolfe. Because what Rolfe has with him is something that it was illegal for an Englishman to have in his possession. He has Spanish tobacco seeds. And his plan is to grow tobacco in Jamestown in the Virginia colony. All right? So Delaware keeps the war going. It ramps up. Eventually, Pocahontas will marry Rolfe. There will be like a 4-year period of peace. All right? She'll be baptized. She goes to England. She is brought into the court of King James I under the name Lady Rebecca. However, she likely caught what in England and never made it back because she dies. Smallpox. Probably caught smallpox. Okay? So, she dies in 1617. Her father dies in 1618. And when her uncle takes control of Ticonderoga, war's back on. Again, it's a roller coaster. All right? Questions up to this point? All right, cool. So on the top left, we have John Smith. On the top right, we have what Smith perceived as the Longhouse ceremony that was led by Powhatan. Bottom left, starving time. Bottom right, that's Thomas West, Lord Delaware. I know it looks like De La War. It's Lord Delaware. And then when Delaware leaves after peace is reached, the next military leader that comes in is a guy that we all have heard of forever, and we didn't even realize it. Sir Thomas Dale. Sir Thomas Dale. All right, so that's why Thomas Dale are the knights. Yeah. Okay. So often when we look at these images of Pocahontas, and you were to ask somebody like, which one do you think is the most accurate? Most people will choose one of these three. That, on the top left, that is the most accurate painting of Pocahontas because it is the only one we have. That portrait was painted in England. There were no portraits of Pocahontas that were painted in Virginia. When did she get married? So we're about 16, 17 years old. Somewhere in that neighborhood. Maybe 18. We just don't know when she was born. We don't know her exact age, but she was in her teens when she was married to Rolfe. All right. Cultural clash in the Chesapeake. At first, Powhatan decides to let these folks live because they're not really on any piece of land that matters to him. His brother, Opechancanough, is like, we need to kill these people. And he's like, no, we're good. We'll see how this shakes out. I mean, Powhatan's like, we're powerful, right? I've got over 40 wives. I have 100 children. I've got thousands of subjects and thousands of soldiers. How's this little group of Englishmen going to take us down, right? So, really the peace, though, and don't get me wrong, there is some like skirmishing and some people die in the early months of their arrival, but really John Smith cements the peace until he goes back to England after the accident, and then from like 1608-9 to like 1614, war is going to be constant. It really ramps up after the starving time in 1610. Really, 1610 to 1614, it's pretty hardcore. Now, after the death of Pocahontas and the death of Powhatan, Opechancanough, the brother, takes control, and they are going to launch what is called the Powhatan Massacre of 1622. They are going to kill 347 settlers out of 1,240 from Jamestown all the way up the James River. Are you guys familiar, like, if you're taking Chippenham Parkway, 150 out to 95, like, you can go straight to the Pocahontas Parkway, or you can get on 95. You know what I'm talking about? And you know, right there, you cross, there's a bridge, and you cross over Route 1, and there's a creek. That's called Falling Creek. That's how far this massacre went. It went from Jamestown all the way to outside of Richmond. So it was actually more people died outside of Jamestown than inside because Jamestown was fortified. All right? One of the victims in this attack was Rolfe. He was killed on his farm. His farm we're all very familiar with. We just didn't know. Have you ever heard of Varina before? That farmland out in Varina, that was he and Pocahontas' farm. Okay? So, around like 1632-ish to 1634, somewhere in that neighborhood, there's a period of peace. And then in 1644, there's another massacre. At this point in time, Opicon Canute is in his 90s, which is insane, right? Like, that this guy's lived this long, and he hasn't died of like either warfare or disease. This gets squashed in 1646, and they basically parade him through Jamestown, and they're going to shoot him in the back. And that's how all this ends. And then they start to push them out, and they're either absorbed by other Algonquians, or they end up on reservations. Not the reservation system that, like, we're going to talk about later in the semester, but it's an early system of reservations. Questions up to this point? Is everybody good? So this is the Powhatan Massacre of 1622. And this is where I pumped the brakes today. Virginia, the child of tobacco. Jamestown's gold was found in the form of tobacco. But the tobacco doesn't really take off until after 1610. Really, it doesn't become profitable until like the 16 teens and 20s, right? So Rolfe blended the bitter Virginia Kinnickinnick and the sweet Caribbean tobacco to make this tobacco that everyone in Europe wanted their hands on. And now tobacco is growing everywhere in the streets of Jamestown and all the way up the James River and throughout the Tidewater, which creates a lot of greed for more land because I don't know if you're familiar with tobacco farming or farming in general, but tobacco farming, tobacco is very rough on soil. It destroys soil, and it destroys the nutrients in soil. And something the English had not gotten into the habit of, that a lot of Native Americans did, was proper what with their crops? Rotation, very good. Proper crop rotation. And they're just like, want more and more and more and more, and then this creates bigger problems as we move forward. Also, the Virginia Company of London falls apart. They don't find any gold. They're not making enough money off the tobacco. People are unloading their shares, and it all falls apart. This will ultimately lead to the first representative government established by the British in the New World, and that's going to be the Virginia House of Burgesses. All right? The House of Burgesses sets itself up as basically like a bicameral two-house legislature, similar to that of Parliament. It has a governor appointed by the Crown. It has a lieutenant governor. It has an attorney general. Does this framework sound familiar to you? This is going to be the framework that will ultimately lead to the development of the Virginia General Assembly, and later the framework that will lead to the development of our nation's government through the Constitution. All right? Often you'll hear people say, the American Revolution was born at Lexington and Concord, which is true. That's the first shots of the American Revolution. There's a really great history professor from Harvard named Skip Gates, and Dr. Gates says, the American Revolution starts here. When you start developing representative government 3,000 miles away from home, that's revolutionary. See where I'm going with this? Okay. So, in the same year, 1619 is a big year for Jamestown. Large groups of women show up in 1619. Also, the first group of Africans arrived in 1619. Now, this 20 or so odd group of Africans arrived in Jamestown completely by mistake. And the way in which, like, the British were not, yeah, there were people in England that were involved in the slave trade, but the use of slave labor was not what the British were doing at this time. Their style of labor was done through what? someone owned for a fixed period of time? Indentured servitude, right? Now, indentured servants were owned for anywhere from 3 to 10 years. We usually kind of split the difference and say 7. That's most indentured contracts or 7-year contracts. So the first group of Africans, and for the next 50 years until the late 1600s, the African groups that come through Virginia were on indentures. So that will ultimately lead to some of the oldest free black communities in America. They were established in Virginia. Awesome. What's even more interesting is 2 of the oldest free black communities in America and also in Virginia were established in what is now present-day Richmond and also what is now present-day Petersburg. We'll talk more about that as we move forward. All right? The pivotal moment where all this kind of ends and comes to a halt is going to be Bacon's Rebellion, which I'm going to teach you guys about that in depth when we get into lesson 4. But Bacon's Rebellion was an uprising that was not only an uprising that was led by a nobleman, it was an uprising that had armed indentured servants that were fighting alongside free men or former indentured servants. This is also one of the first recorded uprisings that was mixed race in the Americas. So I find that compelling. And we'll talk more about that when we get to lesson 4. Are we good? Does anybody have any questions? All right. So on the top left, we have the marriage of Roth and Pocahontas. I don't know if you've been to this part of Williamsburg in the top center. There's like a educational garden there. Has anybody hit that up before? Like when they've gone through Williamsburg? Where there, you kind of have to get there at the right time. But they're growing things that were grown in the colonial period. So tobacco is grown there, and that's tobacco drying. And then the bottom sketch here, or lithograph, is just tobacco farming all over Virginia. I mean, it's practically growing in the streets. Okay, well, that's where we stop today. And just give me 1 second here.